Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. We'll be starting here just in about 2 or 3 minutes. Appreciate everyone for showing up early. Again, we'll be set to start here in the next 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on the future of learning is agile and outcomes oriented, using learning innovation to facilitate workforce transformation. We're going to be starting here in another minute or two. We see people kind of flooding in right now. Please give us a little bit more time and we'll go ahead and start in 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here in about 30 seconds. So grab your water, silence your phone, do whatever you have to do. We'll get started here in about 30 seconds. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started any second now. Just giving 1 or 2 last seconds for people to get oriented. All right, everyone, welcome to the webinar from Infopro Learning. Today we're going to be talking about the future of learning and how it's agile and outcomes focused. And we're going to talk about how using learning learning innovation can help us facilitate the workforce transformation that we're going through. And certainly we don't need to tell you about the workforce transformation, whether you're in our field or you're not in our field. It's all around us, it's unavoidable, and it is becoming a topic that is top of mind for CEOs and L&D leaders alike. Before we get started and introduce you to Sheri, I want to talk a little bit about Infopro Learning, just for 1 or 2 minutes here. For those that aren't familiar with who we are, we've been in the L&D field for over 30 years now, I guess, and really stretch across the globe. So wherever you are, more than likely we are there with you as well. Our focus is really on delivering performance back to organizations, and helping them transform their people so that they can then transform their business. And we do that through a full service offering of learning solutions that can range from anything from learning strategy to content development to leadership and OD solutions, helping you deliver your training curriculum, help you with administration, and even helping you find talent, if that's something that you're interested in and you're hiring and just having a tough job or tough time finding people, just like everybody else is. That's become quite a popular service of ours as of late as well. Again, and you can see in the bottom right, we're fairly well recognized in this space through various different organizations, from Gartner to Fosway, Nelson Hall, trainingindustry.com, and Brandon Hall as well. Enough about Infopro Learning. I'm going to turn it over to Sheri in a second, but just some housekeeping things to get out of the way. We will be sending you this recording at the conclusion of this. Usually you have to wait about 2 business days, but then expect for the recording to hit your inbox, so please check that. If you don't have it in a couple days, check your spam folders. It maybe got caught up there. And if you still don't see it, you're welcome to reach out to us and we'll send it to you directly as well. With GoToWebinar, which is our platform today, they utilize a question panel. It should be in the right part of your screen. You should have a section there called questions. Feel free to use that to ask any questions you might have throughout. We will be taking questions throughout the entire presentation. We'll also allot for a little time at the end there if there's some. Feel free to write them the second you think them though. And again, we'll try our best to answer all the questions during the webinar itself. If not, maybe we'll shoot over those answers at the end. Again, the webinar will be recorded and we will be sending this out to you. With that, Sheri, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nolan. I really appreciate the introduction. Just to start off, let me give you a little bit of an introduction to me. So my name is Sheri Weppel. I am a recovering art teacher, a former instructional designer, transitioned into account management, and now I'm really focused on client success. That gives you a little bit of my organizational background, but personally speaking, I love to run 5K races. I'll stretch it to 4 miles, but that's about as far as I'm willing to go. I have a great dog named Abby, whom hopefully you will not hear on this webinar, but there's no guarantees in this new world that we operate in. I love to travel to different locations. That picture is actually from Alaska, where I was able to travel last summer and was just absolutely one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And I also love to be able to support rescue groups. So I support a rescue group rescuing dogs, helping them find new homes, and it's just a really rewarding thing that I focus on. Agile is such an interesting topic, and it's a topic that I think a lot of people use regularly. We use the term agile regularly. I don't know that we always understand what it really means. So that's part of what we're going to be talking about today. So agile is now used. In the beginning, it was a very specific definition. It was related to software development. It involved, having a Scrum master and sprints. And there was a very specific process that went with it. As we have a tendency to do in the world, we've taken that word and made it mean a lot of other things too. To most, it means the ability to be flexible without the rigor that usually comes with frustration and missed outcomes. A perfect example of agile is actually the space in which I'm currently presenting to you from. When we transitioned to a work from home status, despite the fact that my husband and I share this home, we have an office that's built into the house, but I was working in an office, he was traveling and commuting a distance for work. And so over time, he kind of took over that office that was originally for me during grad school. So when I returned to the house to work from home, all of a sudden I found myself displaced. We didn't want to create another office in the house, so we actually created what I'll call an Agile Office, which is this front living room that I'm speaking to you from today. So it has great lighting. You'll see that I'm actually not sitting in an office chair. I'm sitting in my cozy dog chair because most of the time I'm on the phone. I do have a TV off to my right, which I'm able to project my screen onto. And I have a coffee table that lifts up to a desk. So again, I can get that video aspect and be able to type as well. So Agile, that's a great example of how some people think about Agile. It's just simply the ability to be flexible. So this room can be an office when I'm working. This room can, like a transformer, collapse down into a sitting room or a living room when needed as well. And part of the challenge that we have with Agile in L&D is that misplaced definition as well. And that's what we're going to dive into quite a bit. So let's first talk about what is it, and most importantly, what isn't it? So here's the great example that I love to get started with of what Agile is and what Agile isn't. I've always been a Mac user ever since I was a kid. And when I think about not Agile, I think about how we used to do software updates to our computers. They would only come out every year or two. You would get a big, huge CD or DVD that you would have to do the install from. I can honestly say I don't think it ever took less than a day to be able to do this because there was a period of backing things up and there was never enough file space, and it just became this like super lengthy process to be able to do it. But the more important part is from a software perspective, it was a huge release. And it was really the only release that you would get for the next year or two. Eventually we started to work more agile, but let's, focus on those. Snow leopard would come out. And then I forget which cat it was next time. It might have been puma or mountain lion or something like that. You would have to wait a year or two for the next update to come out. That's not the world that we live in anymore. I log into my app store on my iPhone and I probably have about 30 updates coming out a day. There's still those major pushes and those major releases when they do come out, but you don't have to wait a long time for them. And there's all sorts of minor releases that come across in the same space. And so if you take that concept, it's very similar to how we think about Agile in training. We used to have a very waterfall process where we would have long, lengthy timelines with this big release of this is when the product is coming out, the learning product, the e-learning module, the ILT module. And now what we're talking about doing is more of that iterative process of having a minimum viable product that comes out periodically during the development cycle. If we actually talk about Agile Scrum framework from a definition standpoint, there is a very prescriptive process to go. This is the big gap that I will tell you from a learning and development standpoint of where things fall apart. So the fact that they're falling apart at slide 7 is probably a very bad thing for us. When you talk about an Agile Scrum framework, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. Number one, you have a very clear product owner who is responsible for getting that product out in that specific time period. So they're very focused on that timeline and keeping to that timeline, and they work to prioritize every change that's requested to see, is it mission critical? Is it going to benefit the product? How should it be prioritized? Can it be fit within that time scale? You then have individual team members who are each picking up different pieces and committing to what they can do within that time frame and doing those task breakouts. You then have very quick sprints. So sometimes there's 24-hour sprints, there's 1 to 4 week sprints, which all those tasks filter into. There's a daily stand-up meeting, which is a commitment where the Scrum Master is going to go through and look at all the tasks that are there, what the burn up and burn down charts are. They're going to review where they're currently at with the sprint. You're going to wind up having a finished product at the end of those 1 to 4 weeks. There's also going to be a retrospective of what's going well, what's not going well. Now, if we all kind of take a step back and think about when we have said we've worked Agile in L&D, I think we can honestly admit that there's some things that we missed. We probably didn't have a defined product owner who was purely focused on that timeline and making sure that it got done in that time frame. We probably just kept wanting to put our changes in place and didn't really prioritize and didn't really start to think about how it might impact our timeline. We probably didn't do the time commitment of meeting each day and reviewing those tasks and making sure that everything was going to get done on time. And I'm almost certain that we didn't do a retrospective because we often just move on to the next thing. So you can see how just those 4 things, just those 4 elements, we were moved from the Agile framework and then we're surprised when it didn't work as well as we wanted it to. But I have a good solution for you, and we're going to get to that in this session. So here's just a breakdown. This is a takeaway that you can download from the handout section of the platform. So things that are agile means that you are going to have an early and continuous delivery. You're going to continue to have deliverables. You're going to welcome those changing requirements. You're going to continue to deliver every couple of weeks, and the client and the team are working together as one cohesive team. Everybody feels trusted and motivated. You're going to get a lot of face-to-face time communication in those daily stand-ups. Everything is a working product. It's a work in progress. It's not going to be completely polished, but everything should be kind of functional at each phase as it goes out. You're going to be really focused on that design, focused on simplicity, focused on organization of your team, and focused on those reflections. But I think we can all admit that the first time that we've gone agile, or maybe still as we try and go agile, the client has an expectation of being able to view a finished product at any given time. You know, they want to be able to access the system, pull up the finished product, and have it be perfect. They want to continue to change requirements as they go throughout the process, regardless of the impact that that's going to have to that timeline. They want to see a delivery every day, which if we look back to that framework, it was a sprint every day, but it wasn't a delivery every day. The sprints were 1 to 2 weeks in duration. We oftentimes still have that client vendor dynamic, which is not conducive to the teamwork environment that's required for Agile. We're not often willing to commit to a daily stand-up. We want to just do weekly status calls, which again is not giving us that communication that we need. So there's just not as much communication. The solution tends to get more complicated. We tend to have a lot of hierarchy. And so a lot of the old ways in which we've worked in that waterfall concept are just, we're trying to carry those through and apply them to this agile framework, and it just doesn't work. So what we really need to do is figure out, number one, can we leave those things behind and truly go agile? And I'm going to have a bunch of questions for you at the end of this session where we're going to ask those very questions, and it's going to be open-ended so you can reflect as to whether you're ready or not. Or do we find some sort of a hybrid approach? So I'm going to approach this in a couple of different ways, because Agile isn't just about the development process. Agile is about how we put our teams together. It's how we deliver training. And it's also about the development process as well. So we're going to look at 3 facets. I'm going to give you a little bit of a case study to talk about how we've done it agilely in our organization. And then we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons. So from a case study standpoint, apologies, I have to move this little platform around. From a case study standpoint, you could have a corporate L&D standpoint department who's looking to do a large scale initiative. You know, they have 2 large initiatives that they're trying to roll out. They're constricted by headcount, where they can't hire the individuals that they need. And so they either need to tell their customers, no, we're not going to be able to support you, their internal customers. No, we're not going to be able to support you. Yes, we're going to be able to support you, but not on that time frame. Or they're going to have to deprioritize some of their internal solutions that they have to be able to meet the needs of these 2 customers. What they actually wound up doing was working with us to build a flexible team. We call it a flexi team, but it's an agile team where they can be tasked based on whatever requirements they have. So much like a Scrum process, the core client team focuses on the business and focuses on what the needs and requirements are. And then they task out to this flexi team that we can grow and shrink as they need to throughout the development process. We can have it, the flexi team was very heavy in instructional design in the very beginning, and then started to be very heavy in development towards the end. You know, we had media up front when we were doing a lot of the wireframing and mood boards. So it really gave that business a nice blend of things that they were able to do, and blend of support that they were able to get, that to do that with their own headcount would have been very complicated. So from a budget standpoint, it definitely saved them money, as they were able to, you know, have flexible resources that they could leverage, allowed them to scale, allowed them to also deal with surge, that when it came to the time of deploying that content, we could ramp up a team of 20, 30, 50, 100 facilitators if needed to be able to deploy that content, whereas that would have been a significant time and financial investment for them. And it also really gave them that flexibility that they needed to be successful. So what does that look like? What it really looks like is that you have 3 different populations if you have an agile team. You have your internal FTEs, your full-time employees, and they are going to be the ones who provide that consistency for your stakeholders. They're going to be the ones who are in the business. They know the business. They're going to be able to work with your business. They're going to be the names and faces that they recognize. And they're going to be the ones who help establish those requirements, help with some of that scoping, help figure out what the solutioning is. You're then going to have a dedicated team, which is going to be on the vendor side, or in this case, it was Infopro side. There's still going to be names that your customers recognize. They can be introduced to your customers. They're going to work in tandem with your internal FTEs. And they're going to provide you with that consistency of report. They will feel in time as if they're almost your team. They're going to know your branding. They're going to know your voice. They're going to know your tone. I will say that when you move to this model, it does take time. Much like if you hire somebody, it's going to take, maybe 3 to 6 months for them to kind of get the tone and the culture of your organization. It's the same when you have a flexi team too. You're going to have to spend time with them to help them get to know you, to help them get to know how you speak within your organization, what good looks like within your organization. But once you're able to get through that onboarding, it really is like one single functional team. We then also do have an ad hoc team, and the ad hoc team is a little bit special. So they're going to be some unique skill sets. They're going to be some of the same skill sets that you have in the dedicated team, but just more of them to be able to handle surge. And the funny thing about them is while they're ad hoc to you, they're not ad hoc to us. So these are our team members that we regularly work with, perhaps with other customers, perhaps in other engagements. And so they're very known to that dedicated team that your vendor provides. They just might not be known to you, but they really give you that flexibility and that surge that you need. So when you're talking about an agile team, you're going to, again, get that consistency and that flexibility. You're going to get your ability to scale. You're going to shift more to the task-based work instead of job roles. And so if you remember, or if you attended my webinar 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago at this point, we talked about a world without jobs. And the agile framework and a world without job really go hand in hand because you do start to be more task-based as you look through things. You are going to have an unlimited skill set. So as you have that ad hoc team, you can put whatever skills in there you need. If you need an LMS programmer, if you need a specific facilitator, subject matter expert, technical programmer, the sky's really the limit of who can be inside of that ad hoc team. And it's really going to give you that flexibility of dealing with surge. If you're not agile, you're going to have to justify your headcount every time you want to add a body to your team. And that seems to be one of the hardest things for our customers to do at this point in time, which makes it incredibly difficult to scale. You still wind up having to hire that person. So at this point, you're probably still creating a job and a job description, which may or may not meet all of your needs for your tasks. You're going to wind up having a very defined skill set, and you're going to find it very difficult to deal with surge. So a lot of challenges to not working agile, and this is probably one of the first forays that I would say for our customers to go into if you're looking at going agile as an agile workforce, is probably one of the easiest ways to kind of ease into the methodology.
Sheri, there was a question in here that asked a bit about the justify headcount, and they said, can you expand upon that a little bit about why does not having agile mean and why does having agile mean you can justify your headcount?
So what I find out too often is that, so let's go back to that scenario where we had an L&D department who had 2 business stakeholders. Likely that budget for those projects is coming out of the business. And so you would write a scope of work to that business as to how much that project is going to cost, and all of those heads that you would need to add, or all of those people that you would need to add for your flexi team would be inside of that scope. What I've found and what I've heard from a lot of our customers is that they're often inside of L&D organization. There is a defined headcount that is established by the budget the previous year. And so that headcount, regardless of what business opportunities come in, is already fixed. And so to be able to say, I have 2 new projects that are coming from this line of business and this line of business, I need to add 5 instructional designers. A lot of organizations really struggle with that. And so I'll give you an example. One of our customers has 3 different budgets that he can hire from. He has his internal budget, which is incredibly fixed and is incredibly finite. He has a contractor budget, which is less fixed and is more project focused. And then he has a business budget, which is where he's not paying for it out of his budget, his business stakeholders are. And that one has a lot more room in it because often that initiative will have budget funds associated with it. So when we talk about headcount, it really is dependent upon your organization. It's just something that Agile teams does have a way of being able to compensate if you have headcount restrictions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sheri.
You're welcome. So the other easy way to go Agile, and I'm saving the best for last, I promise, is an Agile training rollout. So again, here's a situation where a customer had an in-house training team, but was experiencing intense surge. So they had a new initiative that they were rolling out. They had 5 or 6 facilitators that they were using internally. And all of a sudden, after they rolled out the training was so amazing that everybody wanted it. And, you know, from the standpoint of headcount, this was one of those customers that was restricted by headcount. Number 2, time scale of being able to ramp up really fast to meet demand. They were really struggling with being able to meet that surge. You know, they wanted to meet that excitement. Ironically, the training was actually about Agile. But they also needed to be able to be responsible too of, did it make sense to bring on 10, 15 new facilitators for a finite period of time when they knew that eventually everybody would be trained and they wouldn't need them anymore. The solution was the customer maintained that core team. That core team helped train the trainer for anybody new who came on board. They also provided consistency and a little bit of threshold that the customer needed to know that their internal needs were always going to be met. That's something that dissipates over time, and eventually you may trust your Agile facilitation team that you don't feel the need to still have internal resources. But it's definitely something that I think customers often phase out of, but like to have that security blanket in the very beginning. You know, they then partner with a vendor to provide an FTE equivalent of these staff members, these facilitators. It helps them to be able to manage their threshold. We also were able to give them ad hoc staff as well, which means we had people who weren't fully dedicated 40 hours a week, but were available in case there were huge spikes that we could pull in. They were already trained, ready to go, and we could deploy them. So from a budget standpoint, again, it helped that whole headcount challenge of being able to establish a budget because the businesses were paying for the training, allowed them to scale, allowed them to have surge, and allowed them to be flexible. So what does it look like? So there's a lot of different things. You could have Agile training content where you could, and so when we talk about Agile training, it's not just facilitation. You could be Agile in how you're deploying your training content. So you could flip your classroom. So instead of having a 3-day training that all of your people need to take, you could take some of that content offline, allow them to do that in the beginning before they attend the live session, and constrict the live session back to a day and a half or a day. That's going to give you increased flexibility for deployment, and they're going to have the increased flexibility of being able to take that pre-work or that flipped classroom training whenever they want. You can also you can use Agile to increase your flexibility by having open enrollment classes. This really, it's a logistical challenge to be able to have open enrollment and make sure that you have enough enrollment to be able to conduct those classes. So you do have to do this with a little bit of caution, but it would make incredible amounts of flexibility for people to be able to take those classes. And you can get past the enrollment requirements by just having cutoff dates in which people need to enroll by, closing out classes or merging classes when needed if headcount's low. And then the example that I had just told you was leveraging a vendor to support your training delivery, having that ad hoc team to be able to support, which means that you need to have less headcount inside of your organization and still be able to support your training calendar. And the funny part about that is you have less of a headcount, but we don't. So inside of our organization, we always have a constant facilitator pool, and we're able to negotiate all of those individuals to multiple clients in multiple sessions in multiple places a day. And so we're managing that larger pool and then just giving you the slice of that you need to be able to support your initiative. So as we look at Agile and not Agile, Agile means you have potentially a flexible schedule. You might have a flexible offering of a hybrid solution of online and in person or virtual. And you might have a flexible staff meeting. It might mean that you have all of these things. You could just have one of these things. if you're not agile, you have a very restricted training calendar. You have lots of long training hours, so week-long trainings, 3-day trainings, and you're still maintaining a extensive in-house facilitator pool, which may or may not be 100% utilized all the time. And so then you have to kind of wonder if you're getting your return on your investment for that facilitator pool. So this just gives you a little bit of an example of some of the things that we're talking about. Now, the last one is probably my favorite, and this is how to successfully implement Agile into your design and development process. This is probably where I spend the bulk of my time talking about Agile. We have a lot of customers who want to work agilely, and I will be honest with you, and I mean this with the utmost of respect for people who are trying to do this. They don't quite understand those constraints that we had talked about up front. And so what this winds up meaning is every time we deliver a product, there's an expectation that it's going to look polished and finished and ready to go. There's an expectation that changes can be made throughout the process. There's an expectation that we're still going to manage to finish on time and on budget. It is possible to have a product that is usable at every phase. It is possible to implement a wide variety of changes throughout the development process. And it is actually possible to do that on time and on budget. But it means that you're going to really have to think about what that development process looks like. It's going to mean that you're going to have to think about what types of changes you make and when. And so what I propose is a hybrid sort of a process. So here's a case study of, a customer was used to working with their internal team and wanted to repeat that with a vendor partner. Well, when you're working with an internal team, you have timelines, but your timelines are a little bit flexible. You know that those resources are completely dedicated to you. You can peek over their shoulder whenever you want and be able to see exactly what they're doing. You can point at something on the screen and say, well, I really think that should be blue and that should be green. And you have that insight into the deliverables every step of the way. And as a result, while that gives you this incredible flexibility, I'm going to be honest, it might be frustrating for that person. But you don't have all of that flexibility when you move to a vendor because they're working in their space, you're working in yours, and whatever frequency needed, you're going to be sending those deliverables to the client for the client's review. Excuse me. So when you have a very defined budget, it's going to cause you challenges unless you're very proactive and you use a lot of prioritization in your process. What we were able to do is establish a social contract of what changes should be made at each given time to be able to avoid budget challenges. And a perfect example would be with narration. And I'll actually tell you a challenging story and a good story. So when we had a social contract, we had a decision that at a certain point in time, regardless of whether we were going to continue to make small tweaks and changes to graphics and interactivity, narration was locked down. There was an expense that was required for the in-person or the real person narration, professional narration. I tend to not call that professional anymore because the machine narration does sound pretty professional too. But there's an expense that's associated with that. There's a time that's associated with that. And so we did draw that line on the sand or that social contract to say at this point in time, we can't make changes to the narration anymore because we're going to incur this cost. Expectations were set as to in each of the different phases of the project, what sorts of changes we shouldn't be making anymore. Here's the sad part of the story. The social contract didn't work. We wound up getting a little bit further into the project and the customer had some additional changes. And unfortunately, those changes did impact the narration. It became a very difficult conversation because the customer didn't have any additional funds to be able to pay. What we wound up doing was, there is a happy ending to the story. We did wind up being able to move to machine narration. There is little to no cost other than implementing the narration into the module once it's done. And the machine narration is not your mama's machine narration. It is not the narration of answering machines and telemarketers that it once was. It honestly does sound really realistic. The only challenge is sometimes typing out the phonetics of what you need to be able to say specific brand words or things like that, but you get through it. And we were able to get past it, and we were able to find a solution. Now, the benefits that they saw was that they got to be able to make the changes that they wanted. They also had the clarity of each of the different phases. They were able to stay within that budget and get that flexibility. But that social contract becomes so key. So when we talk about designing and developing training, we often talk about waterfall, or we often talk about ADDIE, so analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. When we talk about Agile, there's 4 phases to that, and that's discover, plan, build, and review. And that's really what's inside of a sprint. And what you'll continue to do is you'll discover what the needs are, you'll plan out how you're going to address it, you're going to build out that solution, and then you're going to review it and have more discovery. And so you just keep going through those iterations until you get to the end. And without having definition of what changes to make and when, you very quickly will run out of time. You very quickly will run out of budget, particularly if you don't have any kind of prioritization going on and you don't have somebody who the ultimate end truth is that timeline, and that timeline must be met. In waterfall, you do have the tendency to stay on timeline because you have a lot of restrictions. You do have a tendency to stay on budget. It's great for fixed price contracts. What it's not good for is change. And so we all are at the point where we want to be able to make changes whenever we want. And so waterfall feels binding. It feels very restricted. It feels very difficult and cumbersome. And a lot of customers are really struggling with, I got to the beta phase of development and I want to make this, I want to rearrange this module, and we're going, that's going to have a lot of implications. We really shouldn't do that. It's going to impact timeline and this and that and the other thing. And so it's very frustrating sometimes because oftentimes, to be honest, our customers don't necessarily come from learning and development. And so sometimes they're not going to know that it's a problem until they see it. Now, with the Agile approach, what you can do is you can really start to blend those 2 things together. And so you can have an alpha sprint, a beta sprint, and a final sprint. So you can decide and prioritize what types of changes you can have at which phases. We also want to explore the topic of an MVP, or a minimum viable product. That means at the end of the alpha sprint, you're going to have something that's usable. You're going to have something that's functional, but it might not have the professional narration in it yet. It might have machine narration in it. It might not have the full animations to the people or other things that might be happening on the screen because we're not certain that the screen is going to stay yet. It might not have the right graphics in place yet. We might have some placeholder graphics in there too. But it's going to give that customer a true picture of what that's going to look like. And then what we can do is say, okay, at the end of the alpha sprint, we really need to lock down the flow because we're going to start putting in other animations and other transitions, and we need to know what the flow is. So when you get to the end of the alpha sprint, it's just defining what are the things that we need to decide by the end of that sprint. So make sure and prioritize to make sure that we can finish on time and on budget. Same goes for the beta sprint and the final sprint. So at each phase, you kind of get the ability to have something that's usable, functional. You can play with it, you can test it out, you can send it to a user group and see what people think, as long as you have the understanding that it's not a finished product. It's not going to have necessarily the polish or shine that you would normally get with a deliverable that might look and feel like that. And so a lot of this is a level of expectation setting and understanding that with flexibility comes responsibility. And the responsibility is understanding the constraints, understanding what you're getting, and being able to work inside of that environment. It all goes back to that social contract that I had spoken about before. So when you're preparing, oh, go ahead.
We have a question here, and it's one that I remember we've been asked, but I think by some clients before. The ADDIE model became so popular because it was connected to instructional design, and so I think a lot of people liked that they had their own way, right, versus just a general, like how maybe a IT person would go through and design an application. So can you talk, what gets lost, if anything, right, in that process with ADDIE being designed specifically for ID and things of those natures versus Agile obviously being implemented for a wide range of use cases, not just
Mhm.
instructional design. How do you ensure that you still get those components involved in the Agile approach?
So a lot of it is just making sure that you keep true to the domain. And so when you're doing that discovery phase in software could be looking at, it could be doing interviews, it could be looking at test scripts, it could be looking at bug reports and things like that. It's making sure that at that discover phase, you're still doing a lot of those things that you know are the right things to do. So that discover phase is still going to include learner personas. It's still going to include an audience analysis. It's still going to utilize success criteria of what does good look like. It's still going to use all of the things that we know from an instructional design standpoint that we're going to want to implement. And that's why if you look at the waterfall ADDIE process, I do have underneath the discover, plan, build, and review, the phases of ADDIE that still are there. And we're still going to act and use a lot of the thought processes that we used at that point. The planning was really always the storyboard. And so the plan is still, it's just putting that storyboard into that scope of reference from an agile standpoint. The build is going to be always your development cycle. And so it honestly mirrors quite nicely into agile. I think the only thing that in hindsight, hearing that question, which is a great question, by the way, I think your circles are going to get smaller as you go through the different phases. So if I were redesigning this slide right now, I would have my discover circles bigger in the alpha sprint phase and a little bit smaller in the beta sprint phase and a little bit smaller in the final sprint phase, because you're not going to completely repeat that cycle from an ID standpoint. So for example, in the alpha sprint, you might do learner personas, you might do some audience analysis. In the beta sprint, you're probably going to not redo the learner personas, not redo the audience analysis, but you might have a small user group of those learner personas that you send it to and have them provide you with feedback on it. With the final sprint, again, you're probably not going to be asking those people for feedback, but you might have them do some third-party testing and having them test out that beta product to see how it functioned and make sure that there's no major glitches or anything like that. So I think that's the important thing to remember. And that's one of the benefits of Agile is when we did it in Waterfall, we did that design phase up front and we really hoped that we were right, because for the most part, we never went back and readdressed it if we were wrong. In the Agile approach, you do get that opportunity. The thing that I think you need to focus on is not sacrificing anything that we know is right and needed to get a good, solid design. So all of those good things that we know are true and the research and the analysis that we need to do to put a great solution in place, we still need to do. But it does give you those additional touch points in the beta and the final sprints to refine, to reflect, to make sure that we're still on track and to make sure that that final product really hits.
Perfect. So it's more embedded in the
Yes.
model versus, almost at every stage. But then obviously, once you kind of get to the later stages, hopefully at that point, you've locked in the instructional design strategy and that's not revisited every time. Perfect.
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct. Yep. So, and actually that would honestly make a whole other webinar in and of itself to dive into that agile design approach and really break down what you would do at each of those sprint phases. So maybe that's coming to a webinar near you all soon. When we are preparing for success, again, there's a couple of different things that we need to keep in mind. So we need to have those stage gates to ensure that certain elements are finalized before project costs. This is, I think, the biggest piece, that if you take nothing else away from this part of the session, that's the piece that I want you to take away, because that's what makes people upset and say that Agile doesn't work for L&D, is because they don't think about those stage gates and then they miss their timelines or they miss their costs. So that's the important piece to really hone in on. Remember that there's still going to be stage gate reviews and stakeholder reviews. We need to make sure that we're level setting with those stakeholders as to what a minimum viable product are. If we don't have that knowledge transfer and we don't have that communication, that social contracting, then we're going to miss the mark. You're going to wind up having people get an alpha that has placeholder narration in it and images that aren't finalized, and it's going to feel flat because maybe we didn't put all the animation in it. And you're going to send that to your executive stakeholder and they're going to go, what is this? The narration doesn't sound good. The images, aren't what we were looking for. They have like Shutterstock on them. And you're going to get a lot of pushback because we didn't set the tone and set the context before that review. So that's a critical piece as well. And the important thing, and Arijit, who's my counterpart here, would be very proud that this is a part of the deck because he actually mentioned this to me this morning. There's still deadlines and go live dates. Agile does not mean that you are just editing and editing and editing until you're either bored or done editing. You could literally revise something that you've done through a design in L&D forever. And honestly, you should be constantly revisiting your solutions and making sure that you're enhancing them and making sure that you're modernizing them and making sure that you're keeping everything fresh, especially if you're requiring people to take things year after year. But remember that there are always deadlines and there are always go live dates. And so those checkpoints are going to help make sure that we don't get into that do loop of edits and we actually do get to a state of completion without frustration. So again, Agile is going to be very iterative. You're going to have minimum viable products that are going to advance in complexity as you go through those alpha, beta, final sprints. It's going to be very collaborative. There's going to be a lot of daily connects and there's going to be a lot of trust. So you're going to have trust in the team that's working Agile for you, that they're listening to you, that they're listening to your prioritizations, and that they're going to be able to meet your vision. And then if they don't, you need to be able to have that collaborative environment that we can express that, have that conversation and get things righted. If we start to get into a little bit more of a confrontational sort of a scenario, it really takes away from everything that Agile is meant to be. If we're not Agile, then we have a very regimented process. We only have a final product at the end. We have a very vendor-clienty relationship, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but when I write it like that, it's definitely where there's a little bit of friction there. We probably have weekly connects, and there's probably more of an authoritarian sort of relationship rather than a community or a team that's really working together and built on trust. So here are the questions as to why not to go Agile. And these are really questions for you, so I'm not going to answer them for you. But really what I've been able to do is break down for you a couple of the different factors, I think there's 5 in total, that you really need to consider and ask yourself if you're ready to go Agile. So this is my desperate plea to everybody in the L&D community is, if you're not ready, don't jump onto it just because it's a buzzword. Don't jump onto it because everybody's talking about it. Make sure that you either align yourself and set yourself and your teams up for success, or make sure that you stick with whatever you're comfortable with. And for some people, waterfall is just going to be the way to go, particularly things that have a lot of legal compliance. Oftentimes, waterfall is a much better way to go because there's just so many very strict reviews that need to be in place. So just be cognizant of the world that you live in, what you're able to cater to, and make sure that you're making the right choice. So again, this is in the downloadable materials, so you have this available to you that you can refer to. In a waterfall approach, everybody's going to get a very finalized deliverable. It's going to have gone through quality assurance. It's going to have all of the T's crossed, all of the I's dotted, all of the apostrophes there or not there, depending on whether they're supposed to be. In an Agile approach, everything is a little bit more flexible. I'll be honest, sometimes there's bugs because we're moving so fast. Everything does go through quality assurance once it's done with the official sprint. But in the process, we're moving fast. We're making changes. There might be a typo here. There might be some grammar issue here. It's part of that collaborative process. And so it's having that communication of, if having grammar or quality errors are a no-go for you, and if that's kind of like a showstopper inside of your organization, then being able to see the deliverables every day or whenever you want is going to be a no-go for your partner. You're gonna wind up having to put more strict review cycles in process because you just can't waste the time of putting something through quality assurance every single day. The challenges that you would face is that, there might be bugs that might be frustrating. You might have more errors than you would normally see, again, when something has the opportunity to go through quality assurance. And so really it is a question of whether you're willing to go Agile and whether you're comfortable dealing with a more minimum viable product type of deliverable. The amount of changes, this is definitely a heavy hitter. As much as we want to be flexible and we want to be able to make changes all the time we want, there's a satisfying effect of the waterfall approach that you have a ton of changes at alpha, and in the design phase, you have lesser changes at beta, you have lesser changes at final, and it slowly starts to diminish over time. In the Agile approach, that's not necessarily going to be the case. You can make changes throughout that process, and you may continue to make changes throughout that process. And sometimes people find that frustrating because they're so used to waterfall that they feel like they're not making progress. They have, it's something important to recognize that you either have to prioritize and start to put those stage gates in to be able to control the number of edits that you have, or you just have to be accepting of, kind of like with rights come privileges, or I forget what that phrase is, but if you want to be able to make all of the changes that you want, then you have to be cognizant of that. Means that you're going to have a lot of changes and a lot of reviews to go through during that process. And so again, it's just a question that you have to ask yourself if you're ready to deal with that degree of changes and lose that satisfaction that comes with the waterfall approach. Review cycles is definitely something that changes as well. With waterfall, reviews happen at a very predictable time. You have your beautiful Microsoft project plan. Reviews are scheduled on calendar. Often in-person reviews can even be scheduled. With an Agile approach, you might get something Monday morning, you might get something Tuesday morning. The team might have questions because we're all one cohesive team. You may wind up having quick turnarounds that need to happen in order to keep to the sprint. And so the challenge is that oftentimes our reviewers have full-time jobs and their jobs aren't flexible to be able to account for that. And so you need to make sure that you have the bandwidth to be able to support Agile. Otherwise, it just winds up getting really, really, from a timeline perspective, really elongated. Because instead of waiting for all of the questions and all of the queries to come at the end of an alpha delivery or a beta delivery, because it's so iterative, oftentimes the time will stop waiting for a response. And that's really going to lengthen that timeline. So it's something to think about. Are you willing to commit the time to be able to do some of those rapid fire reviews? This is, I think, the most important one, though. In a waterfall approach, you're going to get weekly meetings. You're going to get weekly status reports every Tuesday at 10 a.m. We're going to meet at a team and we're going to discuss the process. In an Agile approach, you're going to have a twice a week call to collaborate on the solution. The reviewer is going to have short turnaround times on things. You're probably going to have a Scrum call every morning to talk about what tasks everybody's going to be associated with. As the business stakeholder, you might be involved in that. You might not be involved in that. What that means is that if you don't have the time to commit to those daily sessions, you might not be able to participate in some of that solutioning. So it's letting go of some of that control. If it might also mean, as we just discussed, having to review a lot of stuff in quick responses. And if you don't have the time to dedicate, it may slow down the process as well. So the time commitment involved in Agile and being able to do quick turnarounds, to be able to have meetings, to keep that process moving and keep it authentic to what Agile is supposed to be, is definitely something to consider as well. And then rapid development tools is something else. So rapid development tools and high-end tools are great for waterfall. Because with high-end tools, particularly animation tools, you really want to have your plan. Video-based tools, you want to have your plan before you exert a lot of energy in creating that solution. So a perfect example would be if we're doing a live video shoot, we want to have our shot list, we want to have our script, we want to have all of our locations mapped out before we actually get the cameraman or woman, get the actors and actresses, get everything kind of arranged. Because to coordinate all of those people to come back to do a couple of revisions is going to be a time and costly activity. So there you're going to probably want to have more of that waterfall approach where you have all your ducks in a row, or at least those sprints, because doing certain things like video shoots or high-end animations and 3D renderings is going to be a very time-consuming process. Rapid development tools are great for Agile. Yes, they do work for waterfall too, so we don't ever want to lose that opportunity, but they're great for Agile because instead of doing some of those word-based storyboards that we may have done in the past, we can start developing right in that tool. We can start developing something that you can hit a publish button at the end of the day and you have something that looks and feels like a minimum viable product, but looks and feels like a finished product. So you can use those high-end tools, but those stage gates are going to become really, really important. So the important thing to remember from a challenge standpoint is that changes still have cost implications. Those stage gates can really help you prevent that or mitigate that. But less flexible or less rapid development tools are definitely going to increase your potential for costs or increase costs. So that's something else to consider as well as you consider whether you want to go agile. And then product backlog. From a waterfall approach, all issues are revised before the completion of the phase. And so there really isn't a lot of things that are hanging on. In an agile approach, you get a project backlog, which is published to a SharePoint site or a team site, and those issues must be prioritized. They're covered in that Scrum meeting, and they're assigned to or picked up by resources on the team. This can be frustrating because it can feel like you provided feedback 3 weeks ago, and that you've seen the product 3 or 4 times since then, and that change still hasn't been made. So sometimes that's very frustrating for people working agilely. We need to understand that that's because perhaps it wasn't on a high prioritization. It might have been changing the color of this. It might have been sourcing a graphic. And we may have deliberately chosen not to do that right now because we're still fine-tuning the content on that particular page. So it does have a tendency to raise questions of quality. It raises questions of whether you're able to, whether you missed something or whether something was forgotten when in actuality it was just deprioritized. Again, if you're in those Scrum meetings, you're going to know that because that's going to be a part of that dialogue. But it's also something to recognize if you're going to be able to mitigate that and understand that just because you submitted a change today, it doesn't mean you're going to see it tomorrow. So the last thing that I will leave you with is that sometimes you do need to take a chance to make a change. There's a lot of benefits to Agile, and I hope that I didn't come off as too negative. I do just want to give you a true picture of the cautions and warnings and things that you might fall into as you go Agile. There can be a lot of really great benefits, like I've said, about flexibility, about the ability to do testings with your actual user groups because you have these minimum viable products. Your ability to collaborate and really work together as a true partner with your vendor or with your team to be able to do that. So there's lots and lots of benefits that you can get from it, just as long as you're aware of the cautions and some of the constraints that you'll need to consider. So at that point, I will turn it back over to Nolan and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, and thank you, Sheri. We have 5 minutes, so I'll try to cover as many. The first one that we had is, are you, how locked in are you to one or the other? Do you have any examples where maybe you had the best intentions of starting off with Agile, but then you got halfway through and it didn't work out?
Yes.
Does that mean you start over from scratch?
No.
Which would
No,
double your timeline?
Yeah, all too often it's easy to go from Agile back to waterfall because you can just start to kind of reframe the deliverable that you're looking at and put all the best practices and all the tools and techniques in place that you had in the past for waterfall. The only challenge sometimes is that there might not be a storyboard, and we kind of have to deal with that. To go from waterfall to Agile will almost always lengthen your timeline, because honestly, that's what happens when we just have alpha 1, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. Is a perfect example of when we started with waterfall. We have every intention of being waterfall, and we somehow wound up in Agile, again, without a lot of those social contracting and restrictions and considerations in place to make sure that we continue to move forward. So I think if you're not sure which direction that you want to go, I would put those stage gates in place, and I would have those social contracting in place from the beginning, and then start with whichever one you want to go with. And as long as you're keeping those considerations in mind, you could be able to flip back and forth between either one, and still be very successful, because you already have those agreements of what needs to be achieved at each of the different phases, and you'll still be able to be successful. It's just, that is, I think, the single most important thing that we need to keep from waterfall is those different phases of development, the alpha, beta, final, and what things we should and shouldn't change each phase to ensure that we meet our timeline and our budget. I mean, obviously, if you have all the time in the world and all the budget in the world, then you don't need those. You can make any changes you want. I think the only challenge you'll wind up having is it can be very frustrating to have a lot of changes and never have a finished product. But having those defined phases in place will definitely help you out.
Wonderful, thanks, Sheri. And I forgot to and sorry for the remainder of questions we'll have to answer at the end. I just wanted to cover a couple things right before we end. One, I did link Sheri's LinkedIn to this chat. Please do feel free to reach out to her. She's a wealth of knowledge and loves to speak to people and help them overcome challenges in a more intimate, setting as well, versus one-to-one versus one-to-many. Also, we did include the slide deck. I forgot to mention that in this handout. So feel free to take that handout. It's in a PDF form. You'll see that attached here. Feel free to take that before you leave for the day as well. With that, Sheri, thank you so much for the time on the webinar today. Thank you, attendees, for joining and learning more about this. And we hope to see you all on the next webinar. If you follow us on LinkedIn on Infopro Learning, you'll be the first to actually get the knowledge of our new webinars. And we seem to always have 1, 2, 3 weeks away. So please check us out there to stay attuned to what's happening in the industry and where it's headed in the future. Thanks again, Sheri.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining. And absolutely, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. More than happy to continue the conversation.
Wonderful. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.